All right, let's begin with a prayer. O Lord our God, our rock and our redeemer, we praise thy great and glorious name, for thou art our creator, and thou hast provided for us the way of life. We ask that thou wilt help us to follow that way and walk that narrow path into life, and help us, Father, to seek always your will in everything. We thank you, Heavenly Father, for the book of Acts and the many things that we can learn from it. We ask that thou will be with us as we study it this morning. In Jesus' name, amen. As we noted, we are in Acts, the 8th chapter, and Acts 16, verse 8. A moment of dyslexia, I guess. But anyway, Acts 16, verse 8. Now, to get us caught up, I took this map and actually adapted it a little bit, but you can see this. Let me see if I got my formula. This area in brown is Asia Minor, and that's the part that's where Paul and Barnabas worked on the second missionary journey, and Paul and Silas. Now, they started in Antioch of Syria, and Antioch of Syria is put over here. See the Syria and Antioch right here. In case you can't see that on the map, or can't see it from your seat. But anyway, that's where they started. They went up to, and you can see the red line. That's basically the path that they took. And they went over to Tarsus, went up through the Cilician Gate, went to Derbe, and then Lystra. And Derbe, Lystra, and then they went on up to Iconium. And Derbe, Lystra, and Iconium were cities where they planted the gospel on the first missionary journey. And so they preached the gospel there, and they planted the church in those particular cities. Then from there, they went up to, the text actually says Phrygia, and we assume that probably included Antioch, and then went up to Galatia. And most maps that show the second missionary journey do not have it going up to Galatia. They have it kind of cutting through that area rather than going up to Galatia. So he must have circled back around to some degree and went up to Galatia. Now, the best map that I've ever seen is in Thompson Chain Reference Bible. You have a Thompson Chain Reference Bible. It's a 2-page thing. I tried to scan it, but I couldn't get a good copy of it to put it on here. And so I just chose not to. I have actually Thompson Chain Reference Bible on my computer from an old program that I have, but it doesn't have the maps. And it took you to another map, and I actually have it on here. But most maps don't show that, but they went up to Galatia, and then down to Asia, and to Mysia. They were thinking about going up to Bithynia. Bithynia is south of the Black Sea. North of the Black Sea would be modern-day Ukraine. So that gives you an idea of where it is in the map. But they went to Mysia, and they went to Troas. And you remember that while they were going through Galatia and Phrygia and Mysia and Bithynia, determined to go to Bithynia, that the Holy Spirit did not allow them to go. Look at verse 7. It says, at the very end of verse 7, but the Spirit suffered them not. So they didn't allow them to go there. And we talked about that a little bit last time. So verse 8, which is where we're going to pick up, and they, passing by Mysia, came down to Troas. Now, just remember that going down or going up or coming down or coming up or something like that, in at that particular time doesn't mean the same thing that it means to us today. When we say going up, what do we mean? Going north. We say going down, we mean going south. Going over would be east or west. We don't have a distinction between it, but that's how we use the terminology. When they use that terminology, they're talking about going down in elevation or going up in elevation. But it really makes a lot of sense. If you're walking, going up and going down in elevation is a lot more important to you than which direction you're going. So if you're driving, who cares? I mean, just give it a little more gas and you go up, or a little less gas and you go down, So, if you're driving, that's one thing, but if you're walking, it's altogether different. So it really makes sense that that's how they use that terminology. And so they went down to Troas. Well, Troas, clear up here by the sea, is by the sea, and so you would expect it to be going down, and as they get closer to the sea. Now, and probably the most noted thing about Troas is that it was south of the ancient city of Troy, and where the Trojans and that kind of stuff and all the things that went about it, but they were just south of that. But Troy by that time had been long time destroyed, but Troas was built up. Now verse 9 says, and a vision appeared to Paul in the night. There stood a man of Macedonia and prayed him, saying, come over into Macedonia and help us. Now this is not 100% true, but generally speaking, visions take place during waking hours, not necessarily night and day, but during waking hours. So you could have a vision in the evening time and it'd be night outside or dark outside, but that would be still a vision because it's waking time. A dream took place during sleeping time. Now, I don't know, there's no way for us to know how they knew that it was an inspired dream or how they knew it was inspired vision. There is no way for us to know that since we can't experience it. But they could distinguish between a normal dream and a normal vision. Now, we all have visions. We don't call them visions. We call them daydreams, don't we? Who doesn't have a daydream? If you don't daydream once in a while, there's probably something wrong with you. We all have them. So, that's what we would call a vision. And is it not the case when you have daydreams that you envision things? Well, yeah. That's why we call them daydreams. I can remember being in junior high, looking out the window during class, not paying attention to the teacher, and completely zoned out, dreaming about playing outside. And where you could see outside in that particular classroom was just a street. But I still could vision being outside, not inside. Well, we all remember things like that. And even though they don't mean anything to anybody else, but we all remember things like that. But this was a vision, and they clearly understood it to be inspired. And it appeared to Paul in the night, and he calls it a vision, and so it must have been during waking hours, more than likely. And it was a man from Macedonia. Now, how did he know he was from Macedonia? I don't know how he knew. Probably there are details in this that we don't know about. It could have been dress. He could have said, hi, my name is so-and-so, I'm from Macedonia. I don't know. But I do know this, that he said that he was a man, that there stood before him a man of Macedonia and prayed, in other words, beseeched or asked, saying, come over into Macedonia and help us. Now this must have been, well, there's no doubt.
visions like this and dreams that were inspired are miraculous events. They're not normal events, they're supernatural. And so God used in the past supernatural dreams and visions in order to communicate to inspired men. And and they were somehow distinguished between the ordinary and the miraculous. Um, so he pleaded with him, come over to Macedonia, and we normally refer to this as the Macedonian call. And Macedonia is a province in Europe. Well, let's just flip that map so we'll get it over there. We'll note these places on the way. But Macedonia is this. Oh, I'm breaking my neck here. It says it over here, but it's actually all of this region above Berea. And now modern day Macedonia is in that area there, but Neapolis, Philippi, Amphipolis, and Thessalonica, and there's actually another city in there too, Apollonia. They were all in Macedonia. Now, three of those cities were capitals in Macedonia. So Macedonia at this particular time was divided up in region. Now Thessalonica was the capital over the whole region of Macedonia, but then you had these colonies, Roman colonies, and you had capitals over those. And Philippi was a capital over that particular area. Now we'll talk about that more here in a second. Now let's pick up with verse 10. And after he had seen the vision, immediately we endeavored to go into Macedonia, assuredly gathering that the Lord had called us for to preach the gospel unto them. Now notice the pronoun change. In verse 7, they went to Mysia. They went determined to go to Bithynia. They suffered them. Verse 8, and they passing by Mysia. But now in verse number 10, it changes to we. So the we would include who? Luke. This is what we call the we, one of the we sections in the book of Acts. Now, it is also interesting that, well, so far, who's on this trip? Who did it start with? Paul and Silas. Then they picked up somebody in Lystra, Timothy, and now Luke is a part of it. So now you have four people. Paul and his companions would be Paul, Silas, Timothy, and Luke. So Luke is included in this. Now, after they leave Philippi, it goes back to they and them and second person and third person pronouns. It doesn't include a first person pronoun after Philippi. Now, what does that tell you? More than likely, Paul left Luke in Philippi. And the next time you come to a we section, guess where they are? Philippi. That's exactly right. So, we have to, pay attention to those kind of things. Now, I've had students who say, oh, that's not important. Well, yeah, it is important. Because, Luke's given us information here that we have to look at and pick up on. And why would he include himself if it's not important? He's inspired. So it is important that we note that Luke was picked up there. So they went to Philippi, and notice when they went. Immediately we endeavored. So here it is at night, he has this vision, or Paul had this vision, and immediately they started working at leaving Philippi in order to go to Macedonia. And so they gathered that God had called them to preach the gospel to Macedonia. And actually, it says assuredly gathering in the King James, but it means they were confident. They had taken the information and they confidently concluded that God wanted them to go to Macedonia. Now, what do you know about Luke? What's the first thing you think about when you think about Luke? He's a doctor, yeah, a physician. So, not a doctor in the sense of having a higher degree, but in the sense of a physician. So, the my medical doctor in Claremore, I told him, well, I had a cyst on my back that needed to be removed, and anyway, it gotten infected and so forth. And I said, well, I tried to talk to my son about, lancing it and taking care of it. And my son said, I'm a doctor, but I'm not that type of doctor. And I told the doctor that, and he got a big kick out of it. And then he asked what kind of doctor he was, and he has a doctorate in counseling. So, but at any rate, he's not that type of doctor. So, there are different types of doctor. In fact, aren't you a doctor? Yeah, aren't pharmacists, right? Yeah. But anyway, there are a lot of different types of doctor. Okay, but we're talking about Luke being a medical doctor, and I found it interesting in reading McGarvey's commentary on Acts. Now, you got to remember, McGarvey wrote his commentary before 1900. I don't remember the exact date. He actually wrote 2 different commentaries on Acts. The first commentary on Acts was actually written in Dover, Missouri. He preached up in Dover, Missouri, which is west of Kansas City, before moving back to Kentucky and working with the College of the Bible, which ultimately became Kentucky University, but in Lexington. And but anyway, he wrote that first commentary, and then later on he wrote a second commentary. I have both of them. They really approach it a little bit different ways. And the first commentary is really good as far as conversions and things like that is concerned, but the second commentary is really good for other benefits. So, he did approach it differently. But nonetheless, McGarvey, he thought that a physician in the first century, like Luke was nothing more than a witch doctor in like the American Indians. Well, that's not the truth. And others have discovered that they were very skillful. In fact, they did major surgeries, they did eye surgeries, and tracheotomies, and I don't remember all the different things that have been brought out since that particular time that the physicians were able to do. So anyway, he was a doctor. Now verse 11, therefore, loosing from Troas, we came with a single course to Samothracia, and next day to Neapolis. Now, Samothracia is, let me see if I can step up here without falling. Samothracia is an island in the Aegean Sea, right there. Neapolis is up here, and Neapolis was the port city of Philippi. But Neapolis was very important because it was on the Appian Way. Now, let me take another map, and there's the Appian Way. The Appian Way started at Byzantium and went over to near Actium. That's not the way you pronounce it, but anyway, it's close enough. And you can see the red line that went through there. And so they're going to follow this Appian Way, or Ignatian Way, Via Ignatia, how this particular fellow called it. But it's a Ignatian Way, and it's a Roman road go to Philippi on down to Amphipolis and then to Thessalonica, and they would stay on that Appian Way. And it was, some of that road is still in existence today. Extremely well-made road. So they would follow that road to Philippi. But they were actually in Macedonia by the time they got to when they got to Neapolis. Okay. So it is also interesting that the word loosing from Troas, that word loosing is a nautical term. And so, you know, it's like launching out or setting sail. And so Paul and his companions then set sail, and they went to, as I said, Samothracia, and then on up to Neapolis. And the city of Neapolis is modern day Kavala, I believe is how you pronounce it. And then they caught the Egnatian Way at that particular point. Anybody know Byzantium? What's the modern day word for Byzantium? It became something else then. Constantinople. That's exactly right. And most of us, because we're a little bit older, we remember a song, and Timbuktu, Constantinople. I don't remember exactly how the tune went, but anyway, if you think about the 60s, there was somebody, or maybe it was even in the late 50s, or somebody that sang a song about Constantinople, Timbuktu. Well, it's the same place, but the Roman, they would call it Byzantium. Byzantium became ultimately when the Catholic Church divided, you had the Western Church and you have the Eastern Church. The Western Church became the Catholic Church, what we would call the Catholic Church. The Eastern Church became Orthodoxy, and then Orthodoxy split. You had the Greek Orthodox, and then ultimately you would have the Russian Orthodox, and then that's even split further. And so now you have the Ukrainian Orthodox. But you know, when you go over to Ukraine, and having spent quite a bit of time there, they have their own, they call them we would say probably a patriarch, but they call it a papa, but papa doesn't mean the same thing as what it does in Russian. But they have their own patriarch. But when we were there in Ukraine, on one of the visits, and I don't remember which, the Pope came to town. But they recognized the Pope as the head of the church, but they also recognized their patriarch as the head of the church. And how they can have two heads, I don't know, but they do. Yeah.
I used to work with a lady who was Ukrainian Catholic, and I said something one day about the Pope. She went off. She said, we don't recognize the Roman Catholic Pope, that we have our own Pope, you know?
Yeah, well, she just have come to a conclusion because they did recognize Pope when he came to Kiev when we were there, and as the head of the Roman Catholic Church, of course. And it is interesting how you refer to the Ukrainian Orthodox, because that's how we would say it, but they would say Ukrainian Catholic.
I was going to say, she didn't consider herself a Roman Catholic. She considered herself a Ukrainian Catholic.
Yeah.
And that's why she didn't recognize the Roman Pope. She recognized the Ukrainian Pope.
Yeah.
Because they were part of the Ukraine.
And it is also interesting when you start looking at the history. Of course, the Catholic Church split, and Byzantium for the Greeks, and Rome, or we usually say Rome for the Catholic, is how we we say it, but Rome wasn't originally the headquarters of the Catholic Church. I mean, it has been several different places, but ultimately it did end up in Rome. So anyway, it is a little bit different than what we normally think about. And this road that went from Byzantium over to Macedonia, it took a ferry or a ship and then went over to Italy and then up to Rome. So the road actually did go to Rome, but you had to take a ship to get across the Adriatic Sea. Okay, so from Neapolis, they went up to Philippi. Now, Philippi would have been about 10 miles inland, and the text says, which is the chief city of that part of Macedonia and a colony. We were in that city abiding certain days. So they went up to Philippi, and Philippi, as he noted, it was capital of that particular part of Macedonia, and it was a colony, it says in the text there. And what that means is that it was a Roman colony, which means the Romans had sent, usually it was approximately 300 soldiers into that town, and they would rule the city. Now, it isn't always the case that they would actually become the city government. Sometimes they would, well, it was like Judea. They allowed others to be there and to rule while they oversaw the ruling of it. And so that's what Pontius Pilate, he was prefector, and he ruled over Judea, but he allowed the Jews to do what they did as long as they kept in line. Well, in some places that's the way it was, and I didn't look up the information whether that was the case in Philippi or not, whether they actually ruled or someone else ruled. But nonetheless, Luke records that they were a colony, a Roman colony. And then Luke also notes that they were there for certain days. In other words, an unspecified amount of time. We don't know. But, you know, if you're going into a town and you're wanting to start a work, aren't there some preliminary things you need to have in force? Well, yeah, you need to find out where you can get some studies. You need to find out what you need in order to get the studies and, you know, things like that. I remember we were the first ones in modern times to go into Riga, Latvia. And, I mean, I remember going to a Hotel Riga, and there were 6 of us, and talking about how are we going to get the gospel to this city now that we're here. I mean, we brought Bibles, we had a plan, and now Robin Haley and myself, we'd already started talking to people. We would just ask them, first thing, do you speak English? And they would, well, a little bit, and we would talk to them and find out they spoke a little bit more, and we'd ask if they had a Bible, and if they didn't have a Bible, we'd give them a Bible, and anyway, and then proceed with asking for studies and different things like that. And we'd come in contact with a person, and I don't remember exactly when this all took place, but who was the head of the English grammar school. Their grade schools would specialize in a particular area. And they had grade schools that specialized in English. And this fellow was the principal, what we would call the principal, the headmaster of the English grammar school. And so we set it up, and we actually went into that school and then offered Bible studies. They were pretty young kids, so we didn't actually, we did set up a couple of Bible studies, but we set up a Bible study with a young lady that had been an exchange student in Alaska, and she spoke very good English, and she talked to her mom, and we went over there, and I think I probably told you about this, but I mean, her whole family was there. And so we then were able to teach them the gospel. But they would have to do those preliminary things, and that's what that certain days would mean. And then verse 13, so during that certain days, they must have found out about this place by the river that they would go to. So verse 13, and on the Sabbath we went out of the city by the riverside, where was wont to be made, and we sat down and spake unto the women which resorted thither. So this assembly of women was on the Sabbath day. Now that probably tells us something, doesn't it? Well, who were known to worship on Saturday? That's what the Sabbath day is, a Saturday. The Jews. And so, more than likely, these were a bunch of Jewish women. Now, why were there not a synagogue there? Well, they didn't have enough Jews. Probably didn't have enough men. Yeah. And so they didn't have enough to do it. So these Jewish ladies then met by the riverside. And Paul found out about it. Probably during that certain days, he was asking about it. He probably asked people about synagogue. Well, no, we don't have a synagogue, but there's a group of ladies that meet out here by the riverside, and in order to worship. Now, it was out of the city, and it was a customary place of prayer. Now, what else do we know about it other than that? Well, nothing. Did they have a building out there? Well, I generally think about it being out there without a building, but it doesn't actually say that. I mean, there could have been a building there, who knows? But nonetheless, there were probably not enough Jews to actually have a synagogue there. And Robertson, in his word pictures, he points out that there was a river outside the city called Gangatus, or Gartis. And it was about a mile outside of the city. And it is, Paul heard about this, and they went out there and they taught them. Now, notice that also he says, and we sat down and spake unto the women. Now, I know in our culture, we stand up to speak, but in some cultures, they sit down to speak. And that was very common in the first century, especially in Palestine. They would actually stand up to read the scriptures, and they would sit down to preach. Now, when we went to Cuba, the law stated that you had to sit down. If you were visiting from outside the country, you had to sit down to preach. And they really saw it as more like teaching, not preaching. And so if you sit down, you're really teaching, and they allowed that. So anyway, when we were first there, we stood up, we preached. We knew, because we had our contacts, that there was a Cuban official there. But when we got to the second place where we were going to preach, and the Cuban officials, they called us aside, and we had to meet with them, and they said, you need to sit down to preach or to teach, I think is how he said it. So from then on, we sat down. But their laws were very clear that because we were there and foreigners, we had to sit down to speak. But, what difference does it make? I mean, if you're used to standing up to speak, it's kind of hard to sit down, but we spoke the same thing. And they did kind of emphasize the idea of teaching, so we would just use a lot more questions, not wanting a response, but questions that causes people to think. And so we did that quite a bit more after that. But anyway, that's what they did. They sat down to teach them. Now, verse 14, and a certain woman named Lydia, seller of purple, the city of Thyatira, which worshiped God, heard us, whose heart the Lord opened, that she attended unto the things which were spoken of Paul. Now, I know that in our lectureship is going to be about conversions, and one of the lessons will be about the conversions in Philippi, and so somebody else will go into some details about this, but I do want to pick up some details about it. So a lady was there, her name was Lydia, and we generally say that she was the first European convert. However, were there Europeans in Jerusalem on the day that the gospel was preached in its fullness? Yeah, on the day that the day of Pentecost in AD 30, when Peter and the apostles stood up to preach, there were Europeans there, and probably then accounts for where the Christians that were in Rome came from, because a lot of people say, well, where did they come from? Nobody had been there. We have no record of them, of anybody going to Rome. Where did they come from? Well, one possibility is that they were among those that were in Jerusalem that went back to Rome, and they planted the church there themselves. Well, this lady was Lydia. We generally, like I said, generally say that she's the first European convert, but that's a little bit not quite right. We could say maybe the first European convert on European soil or something like that we have record of. But nonetheless, she was from Thyatira. Here's Thyatira. Now, those cities marked like this with the little cross there, those were the 7 churches of Asia that John wrote to. And Thyatira was one of those 7 churches. And Thyatira was known for its purple dye. So she was a seller of purple. So you already put it together. Oh, she was buying dyes from her hometown, went up to Philippi, and maybe she did the dyeing in Thyatira, who knows, but she took the goods. I would think that she would take the dye and then buy fabrics there or whatever she dyed, leathers, whatever, and she took it to Philippi and then made garments with that, out of that purple. And so she was a seller of purple. And the purple dye was extremely costly. It was actually made from shellfish. Thyatira was also a Roman colony. And as I said already, that it was one of the 7 churches of Asia that were there. And it says that she worshiped God, most likely indicates, again, a Jewish background. Well, she heard Paul and his companions speak. And actually the word translated heard is continuous action. She kept on hearing. In other words, she didn't hear a word or two. She was very interested. She kept on hearing the things that Paul and his companions taught. And how important is hearing as far as the gospel is concerned? Yeah, faith comes by hearing. Yeah, you're just not born into Christianity. You're not born into the church. You have to hear. And so hearing is important. I always think about Acts 11, verse 14. Who shall talking to Cornelius, the angel said to Cornelius concerning Peter, who shall tell thee words whereby thou and thy household shall be saved. And so it is important for us to recognize the importance of hearing. And then it says, whose heart the Lord opened. Well, you could just imagine the denominations, they really emphasize this particular point, whose heart the Lord opened, like it was a direct operation. Well, the text tells us how the Lord opened her heart. How did he open her heart? By the preaching of the gospel. That's how the heart was open. So don't let somebody use this verse and say, talk about a direct action of God on the heart of Lydia. That's what they want to make it sound like, as if the gospel is not important. Well, the gospel is important. It's not a direct operation of the Holy Spirit or of God, but rather he opened the heart by the gospel. And so she attended to the things which were spoken of by Paul. In other words, well, the American Standard, she gave heed unto the things which were spoken of by Paul. So, in other words, she acted upon those things. Now, verse 15. And when she was baptized in her household, she besought us, saying, if we have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come into my house, and there abide there, and she constrained us. So she was, and her household were baptized. Now, so giving heed then to the things that were spoken of by Paul meant that she was obedient. Well, how was she obedient? She was baptized. That's how she was obedient. Now, the text doesn't record what Paul taught, but doesn't it make sense that Paul taught the Great Commission? Since we're commissioned to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature, and then he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believeth not shall be damned. Well, the Great Commission had to be a part of it. But then this amazes me, because you'll find this with reference to Lydia as well as to the jailer, because it says, and their household. And it says the same thing about the jailer. And they'll say, there you go. There's the authority to baptize infants. Really? You can read that in that? I mean, what you read is, when they heard the gospel, Lydia obeyed. Those who hear the gospel are those that obey. Can infants hear the gospel? Well, they can hear it audibly, no doubt. I mean, if you say something to an infant, they'll turn their head. They'll hear it audibly, but do they comprehend? No.
I don't think so.
No, they don't comprehend. And so, there was an old-time preacher, Raccoon John Smith was his name. That's what they called him, at least. I don't remember what his real name was, but they called him Raccoon John Smith. And he preached in the 1800s. Seemed like it was before the Civil War. And there was actually a couple of books on Raccoon John Smith, and if you get a chance to read them, it's very interesting reading. I really enjoyed reading about him. But he was a real card, and he was known to preach for 3 hours. Now, can you imagine? I mean, preaching for 3 hours. Boy, if you preach 3 hours this day and time, you get run out of town. I knew a fellow that went to Alaska, and a student that went to Alaska. He was trying out, and he preached for an hour. Guess what? I thought, that wasn't smooth move, boy. I mean, they didn't hire him because that's what they thought that they were going to get. And there are things that he could have summarized that he just went on and on. But nonetheless, that's what John Smith was known for. But John Smith, on occasion, there was a lady that was wanting to be baptized, or a person that's wanting to be baptized, and went down the river, and there were a bunch of Baptists down there. And they were getting ready to baptize an infant. And so Raccoon John Smith went over to the pastor and grabbed a hold of him and drug him down the river and dunked him. And the guy says, what are you doing? He said, well, I'm baptizing you just about like you're baptizing that infant. I mean, that infant had no, say in it. I mean, they just, and I don't know if you've ever seen anybody do that, the denomination I grew up in did, quote, baptize infants, but what that really meant was this is what I remember, the quote, reverend put his hand in a dish of water and then flicked the water on the baby's face, you know, and that's not baptism, but that's what they did nonetheless. And, but, you know, you got to read in the text to get this. Now, whoever chooses to do this about, in the lectureship about Philippi and the conversions of Philippi, you might want to look at McGarvey's commentaries. He spent a lot of time. McGarvey also had several debates, and he spent a lot of time on why infant baptism is not right. But it is reading into this text, and that's probably something that somebody needs to deal with in that lectureship. Oh boy. Let's finish verse 15, and then we'll pick up verse 16 next time. So she obeyed the gospel. She obeyed the Great Commission. She was baptized in her household, and then notice that she was hospitable. Well, it is interesting to note that both Lydia and the jailer were hospitable to Paul and his companions once they obeyed the gospel. So these 4 preachers went and lodged in her house, and if she was unmarried, we'd have to ask, well, where'd the kids come from? I don't think that's reasonable. But if she was unmarried and she invited them to their house, wouldn't that create a lot of suspicion? Yeah, I don't think that that's the case. It is, but you know, can you assess? I mean, if you have 4 grown men coming into your house and going to live in your house for a week, 2 weeks, whatever it would be, and you've invited them in, you must have a pretty good sized house, wouldn't you? Yeah, which probably means that she was successful in business, or at least her husband was successful in business. And she constrained us, and the word constrained is extremely strong in the original. It strongly urged us. Huh?
She drug them in there.
Yeah, she just absolutely insisted for them to come. All right, that's where we'll quit for today, and we'll pick up with verse 16 next time.